I've never had this quite with a guest that I know, and I'm not sure which angle to take for the podcast because you have so many things going in some things. But I want to take it because I'm very interested and have always been in Spain, and I know that you grew up there, you're bilingual, and now I found out you speak French and singing in French now. I don't know. I feel inadequate about it because I feel like you dropped that kind of subtly, like, oh, yeah, I'm singing in French now, too. And I'm like,
you know what? I said this to my mom, and she's like, why the hell are you singing in French? I was like, because it just feels so good to speak French in the mouth. Like, just doesn't it feel good? And she just looked at me, she's like, you are so strange. But it's the thing about language, which is that we can communicate different things in, through different languages. And, certain things I can say in Spanish, I cannot find a replacement for in English. And so maybe in some ways it's the perfect metaphor for us in this conversation, because it's like part of the reason why I feel drawn to so many different mediums is because there's so many different ways of expressing things. And I feel most at home in myself when I am, bilingual, when there's a multivocality of expression happening in my life. But with Spain in particular, I think having a childhood overseas and in Spain really shaped me a lot. I think the terrain, more than anything else, the culture, the energy, it's just such a guttural, like ballsy, sensual, beautiful culture.
Yeah.
And
how did you come to be in Spain, and what regions or cities did you primarily sort of come up in?
So my parents were missionaries there, and they were saving the Catholics from hell, which worked out really well for us. Obviously, we were extremely successful.
Well, there's no more Catholics. That's great.
It's just, they were trying to figure out why that happened. It was the stoners. In all seriousness, though, they came to Spain in the early 80s. So right after I was born, we went there when I was, 7 months old or so. And they were working with the Spanish government trying to create anti-drug programs. So at first we were in Zaragoza, which is up north, and then we went to Madrid. And most of my childhood was spent in Madrid. And they worked with the Spanish government doing these, youth tournaments, and they opened a youth center. My mom worked a lot with, a lot of members of our community were AIDS victims and were not being cared for by the hospitals, by the nurses. So that was a part of my mom's, ministry.
Yeah.
So even though I grew up with this kind of like really restrictive Baptist theology, the example of my parents and the way that they lived in embracing other cultures and embracing other people, and embracing art as well. They were both just avid, art fans.
Yeah.
So even though we were dirt poor, we would travel around in our little Volvo and go to all of the art museums and see as much of the exhibits as we could and travel through Europe as we were able to.
Well, that's amazing. And I'm wondering, were you immersed in Spanish culture schools and those things too? So that's a huge up, right?
Yep.
So you're not just at some school for American kids.
And that was really, it was controversial for my parents to make that decision at that time. And this was pre, now Spanish immersion and raising kids bilingually. It's like we have all these studies that show the benefits of that. At that time, it was like, oh, your kids aren't going to know how to speak English and read in English. And what are they going to do when they get to college, Yeah. But they were so committed to embracing the Spanish culture and becoming part of culture that my brother and I went to Spanish public schools, and we thought we were Spanish.
Why would you?
Yeah,
you just want to assimilate as a kid. You just want to be a kid.
Right.
So,
but especially, my first language was really Spanish. English was spoken at home so that we would, learn. But, when you're in Spain, when your childhood is surrounded by a specific culture, there's a phenomenon now that describes, it's called third culture kids. When kids grow up, military or missionary kids grow up in another culture, but they realize they're not, native. Yeah. But because you don't really belong to one or the other, you belong to both. And it creates a different kind of sense of place in the world when you grow up with that kind of fluidity.
Full Exposure Podcast is brought to you by Metro Health, University of Michigan Health, and Dr. Peter Hahn, in appreciation of the creative and artistic visionaries who enrich our lives through cultural connections.